Hello, I'm Yazid Suleimani. I'm from Istanbul. We'll be discussing the Belt and Road Initiative, about which most of us here are very familiar. And we have the expert, Niva. She's here with us. So today, my research project will take this shape. I have 4 parts to it that I will discuss about the Belt and Road Initiative. The first one, which we'll be discussing today, will be on entrepreneurship. The second one will look at firms and industrial organization, finance and banking, and macroeconomic structure. So the policy framework we are working on, we want it to be an integrated framework, the whole 9 yards. So today we'll be discussing entrepreneurship. So this is the contents we'll look at today, Belt and Roads Initiative. We'll talk about it, see what is it really about, how did it come to be. We'll look at the criticisms that have been leveled against the initiative, and then we'll look at the conceptual framework of entrepreneurship, the policy gaps that are occurring at the moment in the on the implementation of the BRI, and then we'll have some discussions. So generally, like we were discussing with Niva, the Belt and Road Initiative by itself, just in Central Asia and, not just in Central Asia, but in other regions, they have made an enormous amount of investments, especially in terms of infrastructure and energy. Now, in Central Asia, the amount of aid given by China, not just through the BRI, in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, it has been increasing to enormous amounts. So you can see trade loans that has been given by China to the countries, especially in Kyrgyzstan. Here you can see the amount has been increasing all through these years. In Kazakhstan, because of the recent economic troubles they've been having, it has been decreasing, but in terms of numerical value, it has been increasing. FDI. In Kazakhstan, the FDI has also been increasing, although it has decreased towards the end, towards the last years in 2015 and 16. But in 2017 and 18, it has increased because of the new initiative that was announced by the president. Now, value of turnover, the projects that China has done in Central Asia. In Kyrgyzstan, increasing, then decreasing a little bit, because this decreasing in the last years has been because of the recent crisis. At the time, actually, in the Chinese economy, they had some currency problems. So, despite that, you can see the amount increasing from almost just 2 billion to over $4 billion. So, China has made an enormous amount of investment in Central Asia. Now, what are the problems that has to do with policy decisions that is connected to these projects? China's trade with Central Asia. Percentage, Kyrgyzstan increasing, doubling actually from 14% to 28%. With Kazakhstan, it has remained stable, although the numerical values have been increasing. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the same as well. Now, let's talk about the Belt and Road Initiative by itself. What is it and how did it come to be? See, when China began transforming its economy from socialist to a socialist market economy, as they would say, under Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, the focus has been to transition the economy gradually. They started with trade, then energy. When you want to, if you start looking at generally projects of this nature, look at the Marshall Plan. The investments made with the Marshall Plan in Europe has been mostly, how do I say this, encompassing. It goes through everything from human rights to education. Goes from human rights to education, to security policies, industrial policy, and everything. The Belt and Road Initiative is not a stand-alone project. To understand the project, you have to go back to this transformation that started under Deng Xiaoping. They started with trade. The focus China had at the time was increasing its trade with its neighbors, with other countries in the world. And by the 2000s, China was the largest trading partner of most countries in the world. Now, to push this kind of trade policy, you need energy. At the moment, China is by far the largest energy consumer in the world. So, this security, energy security, trade security, is very important. There's a geopolitical aspect, there's a geopolitical approach to the BRI. This is securing their energy and securing trade. Now, in the push for this transformation, there occurred an excess capacity. Now, every economy that goes through this kind of transformation, let's take an example with the American economy. In the 1940s, after the World War II, America was by far the largest economy in the world. They had, at the moment, China has over $3 trillion in foreign reserve. America at the time had an enormous amount of foreign reserve. Now, what to do with that amount of money? The economy was going well at the time. Franklin D. Roosevelt, they had this much excess capacity in terms of production and in terms of resources. What they did was create the welfare state, redistribute the money to the people, social security and all of that. The Chinese social security is a very slippery slope. Once you start down that road, it's very dangerous. As you can see at the moment, America is having the same problem. The social security is underfunded, the liabilities are going through the roof, and nobody wants to stop it, politicians. What the Chinese are doing with the excess capacity and the excess resources is not redistributing it to the people, but actually try to maintain a stable level of economic activity. Because if you start having stagnant factories and nobody's buying your products, you begin to have problems. So what they are doing with the BRI is to create market outside of China. Now, to create these markets, you need infrastructure. You need railways, you need ports, and not only that, you need your potential markets to have the capacity, to have the technology, to have the level of development, to actually absorb your excess capacity and also be a productive partner in your trades. So as you can see all over the world, Chinese companies are going there, ports, railways, everywhere here in Central Asia, in Africa, South America, all over the place. Chinese companies are dominating. And that has helped them to secure their energy policy. So if you look at just last month, this year actually, the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation took over the stake of Total in the Iranian gas projects. They call it the South Pars gas field. It was a very huge project, but because of the nuclear deal, they had to pull out, and the Chinese took over. So this initiative is not a stand-alone project. Like Niva said in her research, it has a lot to do with domestic stability, because if the economy in China is stagnant, people begin to get unhappy. It will create a sort of resentment and a lot of instability, and that has to be avoided. One of the ways to avoid it is to export your capacity by creating markets outside the country. Meanwhile, the local economy is transforming to a consumer-based economy. Now, we look at the criticisms. First, the first one is one of the most important ones, actually, natural resource exploitation. A lot of the loans China gives to countries in Africa and Central Asia, and most of the most of the projects they undertake to do, like railways, bridges, infrastructural projects, they don't take money back. They take the loan is paid back in terms of access to resources, quotas and all of that. That has led to a very, not exactly dangerous, but a very complicated relationship with these countries, because the citizens feel their resources are getting stolen, so to speak, by the Chinese and all of that. But that in itself is not bad, because if most of the projects like this, if you look at it by the Americans, by the British, all of these kinds of projects, when they go in, the loans are not being paid back directly. They are paid to companies to go in there and execute projects. The second criticism, lack of soft infrastructure. When we talk about soft infrastructure, we talk about stuff like human rights, gender equality, education, governance. As under this initiative, the Chinese do not attach any requirements or any conditions as to human rights or security policies or gender equality and all of that. They invest and leave all that to the countries. In a way, it is one of the best parts of the initiative because every country has the opportunity to localize the initiative. And it also excuses China from the accusation of meddling in internal affairs of sovereign countries. Now, the bad part that people tend to say is that it really creates a big disadvantage also to the BRI, because if you go to a country that has very poor legal structure, poor human rights records, and all of these, soft problems, so to speak, it becomes very difficult to actually go in there and do business, especially if there is a very poor political climate. But then forcing a country to change its political structures just so you can take advantage of it or whatever, it creates bad impression for you because you now look like you are interfering in their internal affairs. Which leads us to the third one, corruption. A lot of times when people criticize the BRI, they bring up the idea that when China invests in countries, if it's a corrupt country, for example, they don't try to avoid that. They take advantage of it. They use it to further their interest, which is not exactly, honorable, but it still would have been good if they conditioned their investment on reduction of corruption and proper governance. The last one, loss of sovereignty and excessive dependence. A good example of this is Tajikistan. A lot of people feel that it has been said actually that Tajikistan bought by China through the BRI. They invest there, and the government is now, directly under the control of the Chinese and maybe a little Russian. This has also made some countries wary of Chinese investments. Like Kyrgyzstan, for example, they pull back a little bit in terms of participating in the BRI. So now these criticisms are not all without merit. They all have their merits, but some of them, for example, the types of soft infrastructure, it's okay, I think, but to try to avoid meddling in the internal affairs of countries is a very important aspect of that. And meddling, so to speak, in these activities would create, it will make it hard for the countries to localize the initiative and make it their own. Now we'll take a look at entrepreneurship. So we talked about the BRI and what it's all about, the problems that people, the criticisms it faces from people. So in terms of that, how can we include entrepreneurship? See, entrepreneurship has been defined so many ways. Joseph Schumpeter, he defined it as, creative destruction. Israel Kirzner, a very good scholar, defined it as, perceiving opportunities. And Frank Knight, he defined it as, a risk taker. But the more complete definition of or conceptualization of entrepreneurship will be from Mises. See, Mises defined entrepreneurship as anticipation of future prices. You look into the future, you look at the needs that will come up, you anticipate them and you invest, you prepare for it. Now, in a sense, you are taking risk, you are perceiving an opportunity, and by perceiving this needs and creating new products, you are actually destroying some things to create new things. So it's also attached to Mises' theory of praxeology, the study of human action. You judge a need, which is a judgment of value, and then you have a judgment of means, how you are going to get there. Now, if you want to invent something, you want to create something new in a market, how do you do it? When you talk about past products, let's say for example, cars are there, we use them. You focus on efficiency, how to make it better, okay? But to create new products, you don't think about efficiency. You just try to make it work. So if you look at the big pharmaceutical companies, Novartis, Amgen, Merck, to invent one drug, they invest millions, billions to get it up and working. So it's a judgment into the future, and a very important part of entrepreneurship is capital accumulation. You need to spend a lot, most times, you need to spend a lot before you can actually get a product out. Then you recover your investment. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Now, by creating a new product, you are pushing the market boundary. So let's think about, for example, the first car. Right now we have self-driving cars, but let's talk about the first car. The first car, it was very basic. There was no air conditioning, there was no sound system, nothing of the sort. You just drive and go where you want to go. But let's say Ikram here has an idea. He wants to put in, let's say, a sound system in the car. Well, to put that sound system in the car, there is nobody that's producing any part of that sound system. So he has to create a new market all by himself. He has to find somebody that will create the casing. He has to find somebody that will create those buttons. Everything has to be from him. Now, if it succeeds, then many other people will start joining the market. And by that, before you know it, we now have cars with sound systems. Or let's talk about a telephone. Just simple mobile phone. All of us here are old enough to remember, days when you had phones with buttons. Now we have phones with no buttons. Actually, the first idea for this kind of phone was at Nokia. Yeah, they said, we have an idea for a phone with just one button. They were like, no, it's not going to sell. So when Apple thought about producing the first iPhone with one button, they had to get a touch screen, single button, lots of things they needed that were not on the market. So they had to go and produce it themselves. So that accounts for the huge upfront investment needed in entrepreneurship. So especially if you look at high tech, for example, cars or computers or pharmaceutical products, they require huge upfront investment. Now, we talk about how this creates market. Now you have new markets for iPhones. You have specialist producers who produce only these specific parts that you need. So you have a market, you have an idea for a product, you are able to bring it to market. The market has now, established itself. It's now part of the economy. How do you keep it sustainable, growing, continuing? By continuous innovation. The moment you stop, you start regressing. The economy goes down. But you have to keep going, pushing the boundary of the market, letting new products come in, old products die out. To do that, you need, if you have, let's say, a country let's say you have an economy, very innovative, it's growing, everybody is prospering, the economy is growing at a very high rate, there are new products, everything is okay. Once you change the structure of governance, for example, you bring in new laws, you add new taxes, you bring in new tariffs, you depress the economy. And everybody that was there, people who innovated in the first place to make the economy great, will leave. Now, governance is a very important part of this. Why? Because the kind of policies you put in place will determine whether people are innovating, whether people are prospering or not. That leads us to security. Security is based in prosperity. If people don't have anything to lose, they don't have their success, they don't have their way of life, their comfortable way of life at risk, they are not safe. If they have, these things are at stake, the prosperity. If you are a successful country, for example, you don't want to fight with you don't want to fight with your neighbor, because it's going to destroy your own economy. So the basis of security is in the governance. The governance is based on the economic structure, the kinds of policies that you put in place. Now, let's talk about the policy gaps. We've seen the BRI, they come in, they make investments, they don't meddle in your internal affairs, they invest and they go. So why do we keep hearing of all these complaints? We keep hearing complaints and complaints and complaints about the BRI. You see new railways going up, you see new buildings, new ports and everything, very, very big infrastructural investments, but the local people don't feel the effect. You don't see any rise in prosperity, and if you do, it's very little. The first problem with that is this. The first gap is that the top-down structuring. So this means you have a kind of governance structure where people at the top make plans, will build a new railway, will build a new bridge, new roads, connected, new ports, and everything. These are things that the local people have no way of taking advantage of. And this is one of the root causes of the criticisms you hear. So for example, let's say China comes in, they build a very big railway from here to Osce, for example, but the Kyrgyz people are not using the railway. Now the Chinese cannot invest billions in a railway and then just let it sit there. So they bring in their companies to come and use the railway. Now they bring in their companies, but then they cannot find qualified employees to run the company. So they bring in their own employees. So now the Kyrgyz people will start feeling they are being colonized, for example. They feel like, okay, it's our country, but then they don't hire us to do the job. They don't use our companies. That creates the resentment that you hear about, the rise of xenophobia in Central Asia. And it all starts with the approach, the top-down approach. It's not just about building railways. It's not just about building, big factories, pipelines, and everything. It cannot work. You cannot build an economy from the top down. You build an economy from the ground up. If you don't have entrepreneurs, people who create things, people who are the engine of the economy, they keep it going. They don't grow the economy, then you will not have an economy. The railways will just sit there, the roads will just sit there. The second problem, the insufficient social capital. Education, training, skills, all of those things are lacking. You can build all the railways you need, you can build all the bridges you need, all the power plants you need. If there are no people smart enough, if there are no people entrepreneurial enough, innovative enough, creative enough to make use of them, to utilize them, then they become useless. They just sit there, and the invested capital is wasted. These are the two most important problems that affect the BRI. Now, how can we remedy that? How can we make the BRI work? Now, you have bridges, railways, capital investments here. What you need is to connect it with the people, with entrepreneurs, people who can build a new economy, make it run. Now, the first thing there, education. If people don't know, if you don't teach people, you don't change their perspective that, they can create new things, they can use this. If you don't do that, then it stays there. That's the first step, awareness. Second one, vocation. When we talk about vocation, we talk about teaching people the skills necessary. Different skills, it doesn't matter. By letting them be entrepreneurial, they decide, I want to learn about computer software programming, or I want to go into pharmaceuticals or into manufacturing. There should be these opportunities for them to learn the necessary skills and qualifications they need to go into these areas. Third one, infrastructural support. Now, this is not a really big problem. It's being handled, I think, in a very good way because, most of the major investments under the BRI are in terms of infrastructure. So when you talk about infrastructure, for example, if most of the people in a particular, the entrepreneurs in an area are tending towards computer engineering. They should have the facilities, computers, if they need internet or the buildings, all of that. If it's manufacturing, the same. Pharmaceuticals, the same. Now, the BRI itself, how can it provide this support? First one, capital. Before you can produce anything new, you have to invest the upfront capital. The more high-tech it is, the higher the investment you need to make. Like we said, for example, in pharmaceuticals, you invest billions to invent one drug. That is not a problem with the BRI. They've invested over 900 billion to date in so many of these projects. The second one, technology. And in this, technology transfer. So you can't keep the people, dependent. So by providing the necessary technology, if it's in terms of construction or in terms of tech and whatever sector it is, access to these technologies are very important. It is very important to have access to the technology. Third one, training. Being that most of the countries that are involved in the BRI, are less advanced than China, access or provision of training and, skills training, technology training, and all of these things will go a big way in bridging the gap between all this infrastructural investment and getting the people to rise to the occasion and utilize them. Without that, there will always be this, space, this big vortex between them. We keep building bridges, no one is using them. So we bring our companies to use them, they can't hire anyone. So we have to bring in our own people to use them. At the end of the day, there's either going to be a clash between the two, or the Chinese will just withdraw and stop investing, because when we invest, we don't recover the economy, we don't see the economic benefit. We don't see the profit that should come from that, the investment, the market that we wanted to create is not there. So the investments will keep coming, but unless there is support for entrepreneurship from the ground up, the intended market will not be there. And if the intended market is not there, there are only two options. Either one, the Chinese import their own companies and people to create that market, or they stop investing at all. Both of them are bad options. But the third option is to create an entrepreneurial environment where the local people rise up. They live there, they know their problems. And that is one of the biggest benefits of the approach taken by the Chinese in the BRI. We go there, we don't tell you what to do. We invest, you take advantage of it. So for example, maybe the social structure, let's say in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan are different. So the entrepreneurial environment in both countries will be different. So you will have BRI in both countries, but they will have different structure, so to speak, because the problems being solved by innovation in this country is different from the problem solved in this country by entrepreneurship. Now they will both have growing economies, but they will have different macroeconomic structure. So the first problem that needs to be solved is entrepreneurship. Encourage, teach, and then provide support for this. Without that, I doubt it will continue in a nice way. The investments will keep coming, and the intended markets will be created. Thank you.